It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. When I was asked to participate in this excellent discussion, I started by inquiring into the conventional meaning of the Monroe Doctrine. And to answer this question, I consulted the United States National Archives, because after all, it is in the bowels of the US government that the Monroe Doctrine was initially conceived. And according to an 8-paragraph summary of the doctrine contained in the US National Archives, the doctrine was, as Radhika mentioned at the outset, first articulated by President James Monroe in his 7th annual message to Congress on December 2nd, 1823, over 200 years ago. And the European powers, according to Monroe, were obligated to respect the Western Hemisphere as the United States sphere of interest. According to the National Archives, Monroe warned European nations that the United States would not tolerate further colonization or puppet monarchs in the Western Hemisphere. The National Archives goes on to state that as late as 1962, the Monroe Doctrine was invoked when the Soviet Union began to build missile launching sites in Cuba. So as framed at the time of its articulation, its initial articulation, it sounded like an anti-colonial doctrine. That's the way it was presented to the world, and one which was designed to ensure the independence and sovereignty of states in the Western Hemisphere. Now, a few points I want to make about this articulation of the doctrine. First, the Western Hemisphere is generally understood to mean the Americas and the westernmost parts of Europe and Africa. It encompasses, of course, half the planet and is obviously a vast space. According to the conventional understanding of the Monroe Doctrine, the doctrine encompasses Argentina and Chile, whose capitals are more than 8,000 kilometers from Washington. That is further than the distance between Washington and major European capitals such as Berlin and Rome. No one who defends this doctrine has ever explained the logic of including such distant countries in America's sphere of influence. At any rate, it is clear the doctrine clearly extends far beyond the countries bordering on the United States. And I think one of the common misconceptions is that it is intended to defend the United States from threats on its borders or near its borders. That's clearly not true. Second, the National Archives explains that the doctrine was intended to preclude the further colonization of the Western Hemisphere, as I mentioned, by European powers, and the installation in the Western Hemisphere of puppet monarchs. However, what if a non-Western power such as China does not seek to colonize or install a puppet in a country of the Western Hemisphere, but simply engages in mutually beneficial commercial relations with such a country? Would the Monroe Doctrine be applied to such a relationship? Well, I think that Trump has clearly provided the answer to that question. China, as one of our colleagues just explained, is engaged in mutually beneficial commercial relations with the country of Panama, and the United States has objected vociferously to that, even though no one could plausibly argue that the government of Panama is a puppet of the People's Republic of China. In fact, if anything, it is a puppet of the United States and has long proven itself to be a puppet of the United States. Now, after all, another point I wish to make is that the Monroe Doctrine never really went away. The peoples of the Western Hemisphere have had to deal with it continuously since the time of its first articulation more than 200 years ago. Some of you may recall that former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry told the Organization of American States in November 2013 that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. But a mere 3 years later, Donald Trump came to power. In 2017, he implied that the doctrine remained enforced when he raised the possibility of military intervention in Venezuela. And as we all know, the first Trump administration imposed harsh sanctions against both Venezuela and Cuba, even though neither of them posed the remotest threat to the security of the United States, and neither of them could be plausibly argued to be a puppet of any non-Western power. These two examples highlight the examples of Venezuela and Cuba, another aspect of the Monroe Doctrine that is poorly misunderstood or understood. The doctrine does not exist simply to nullify threats to U.S. security. In practice, it has been used, in fact, to enforce servitude to Washington. Washington has never had a problem with puppets in the Western Hemisphere as long as the puppets belong to Washington. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine has been applied again and again to punish governments in the Western Hemisphere, like Venezuela and Cuba, that refuse to act as vassals of the United States, even when those governments are not vassals of any non-Western power. Interestingly, in 1902, Canadian Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier stated that the Monroe Doctrine was essential to Canada's protection. The doctrine, he claimed, provided Canada with a de facto security guarantee by the United States. Wilfrid Laurier sounded like, a local capo who is paying fealty to the Don, the Godfather, in Washington. Laurier promoted the misconception that the Monroe Doctrine is designed simply to preclude the domination of Western states by non-Western powers, but as I mentioned, that is plainly false. Nowhere is this more obvious than in Canada today. Canadian foreign policy is almost a carbon copy of U.S. foreign policy and has been for decades. Through the auspices of NATO, NORAD, and the Five Eyes, Canada serves the interests of Washington in the military and intelligence spheres. Economically, Canada is more dependent on the United States than any other country by far. In short, Canada has become a vassal to the U.S., even in the cultural sphere. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. And because Canada has allowed itself to be placed in a position of fealty and dependence to the United States through its embrace of the Monroe Doctrine, it is extraordinarily vulnerable to economic and military threats to the United States. A final preliminary point I wish to make about the doctrine is that it does not preclude U.S. imperialism in the non-Western world. So it's not reciprocal. On the contrary, throughout the post-World War II period, the U.S. government has engaged in ruthless imperialism throughout the non-Western world, and including, of course, in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, West Asia, and Eastern Africa, amongst other areas of the world. In other words, since the doctrine was articulated, there has never been a time when the U.S. government acted as if it was obliged to refrain from colonizing or installing puppets in nations of the non-Western world. And this was true even during the Soviet era. One could argue, in fact, that in the post-World War II era, the U.S. government has applied the Monroe Doctrine to the entire planet and not just the Western Hemisphere. In a way, I regard the Monroe Doctrine as a distraction. It means little more than U.S. imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. And in our lifetimes, U.S. imperialism was never confined to the Western Hemisphere. Its scope has always, in the post-World War II period, been global. The Monroe Doctrine is simply a way of making U.S. imperialism seem more palatable in the Western Hemisphere by casting it as a defense from the encroachment on the sovereignty of Western powers by non-Western states. Now, at this point, I'd like to share with you in a normal world, I would say it's a shocking video, but I think it's actually become par for the course. It's a video that Trump posted on his X profile in the last couple of days about Greenland.
In the cold silence of the tundra, a bond was born, not from treaties or trade, but from blood and bravery. While Germany controlled Europe, the Nazis set their sights on the Arctic. Greenland became an unwitting combatant, and the United States stepped in, not to conquer, but to protect. In 1943, nearly 1,000 American soldiers with 4 chaplains set sail from New York to Greenland, carrying with them hope, duty, and a quiet fear. But their ship was torpedoed by a Nazi U-boat, and the frigid waters of the North Atlantic became a grave. Those 4 chaplains gave up their life vests, giving their lives so that others might live, to protect America and Greenland. Their sacrifices helped win our freedom, and we will never forget. Together, Americans and Greenlanders stood as sentinels at the top of the world. But today, Greenland faces new threats, from Russian aggression and Chinese expansion. Our shared legacy lives on in every joint mission, every Arctic patrol, every partnership forged in the shadow of melting ice and rising tensions. This is not just history, it is destiny. Now is the time to stand together again. For peace, for security, for the future, America stands with Greenland.
That's right, folks. America stands with Greenland, and it is the destiny of Greenlanders to be subjugated to the domination of Washington. I hope you were entertained by that, Lotta. I don't know if you had seen that video previously. So obviously, this is an outrageous piece of propaganda, but a few things stood out for me. First, the video cast the United States as the protector of Greenland, dating all the way back to the Second World War. It used the phrase not to conquer, but to protect. The video omits to mention, of course, that the main contributor to the defeat of the Nazis was not the United States, but the Soviet Union. Now that the Third Reich is gone, the propaganda machine of the United States must conjure up new threats to justify its, quote, protection of Greenland. And predictably, the new threats are Russian aggression and Chinese expansion. There is no evidence, however, that either Russia or China have designs on Greenland. And what's most remarkable about this video is that neither the governments of China or Russia have stated any interest in incorporating Greenland into their territory. It is the United States that's doing that, and they are telling the world that it is Russia and China which threaten the sovereignty of Greenlanders. The only real threat to Greenland is the United States itself. And as an aside, after watching this video, I wondered how Trump squares his purported desire to normalize relations with the Russian Federation with the claim in this propaganda video that Russian aggression threatens Greenland and necessitates the US government's confiscation of Greenland. Any objective observer can see the true reason for Trump's obsession with Greenland is resources, as Lotta explained, and the resources of Greenland are vast. In particular, Greenland has one of the largest identified deposits of rare earth elements. They apparently are intimately mingled always with uranium and thorium. There's a mountain rich in such radioactive ores located very close to the Inuit village of Narsak that developers would surely like to strip mine. If approved for mining, the main commodity for Narsak would be rare earths, and the secondary commodity would be uranium. The economics of the project dictates marketing both. However, there's currently a ban, as I understand it, on uranium mining in Greenland, which precludes this mining project from going forward. I also understand on March 28th, the coalition government in Greenland implemented a ban on uranium mining, or is expected to uphold a ban on uranium mining for the foreseeable future. So the best way for the Trump administration to overcome these obstacles, of course, is to seize control of Greenland and gut whatever environmental protections are currently in place, as his administration is doing in the continental United States. And finally, I want to say just a few words about Russia's interesting response to Trump's attempt to confiscate Greenland. A few days ago, speaking from the Arctic, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Washington's ambitions for the Arctic nation are serious. He went on and he said, quote, "These plans have deep historical roots, and it's clear that the U.S. will continue to systematically pursue its geostrategic, military, political, and economic interests in the Arctic. As for Greenland, this is a matter for two specific countries. It has nothing to do with us." I'm interested in the thoughts of others in this conversation about why Putin made that statement and what it means. Personally, I don't really think it amounts to anything, because if the United States were to move militarily on Greenland, and who knows, Trump is perfectly capable of such a thing, direct intervention by the Russian Federation would almost certainly precipitate a nuclear war. If this matter were to come up for a vote at the UN Security Council, I have no doubt that both the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China would object vociferously to this brazen violation of the United States obligations under the United Nations Charter. Thank you very much.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.